Today I have Professor Alex and Thomas as an interviewee, this time not as my teacher. So Professor Alex has taught me like five odd courses related to macroeconomics, history of economic thought, and growth theory, among others. But like on my journey as a master's in economics students, picking up this book still fills me with much intimidation as it would an rookie. I won't use the word rookie because Professor Alex is with us, so I'll say uninitiated economic student. Um, so a little introduction about Professor Alex, that he has done a PhD from Sydney University and has added to his name numerous journal articles, book reviews, and countless other publications, among which are two books. One is Pluralistic Economics and Its History, a book he co-edited in 2019. And the other is the topic of discussion today. We have a Cambridge University Press publication just released a couple of weeks ago, Macroeconomics: An Introduction, which I have here with me. So, Alex, we'll start our this interview, and we'll try to understand your book better. So, the first question that I was thinking about, like once I started reading this book, that uh, and because I've been your student also, so most of the textbooks adopt a dominant marginalist economics framework, while this book follows a different path. It highlights the pluralistic nature of economics. How important do you think it is to introduce pluralism to undergraduate students?
Thanks, Shubhankar, first of all, for having me here and asking these questions. And as always, I think, from the first course onwards, you've asked me questions. So I'm happy that we are continuing that tradition. And anyway, based on the questions that you sent, it has also made me think a little bit and reflect more about it. So the reason for introducing pluralism to undergraduate students, I feel in a way, as human beings, we are all very social in nature and we are necessarily pluralist in the way we function. And what I mean by this is that we combine, conscious and not very consciously, but without thinking very consciously, insights, ideas from several individuals, different outlets, and different experiences. And the UG program or any undergraduate or postgraduate program in economics is we are trying to get students to think like an economist. But then the question is there are different schools of thought within economics. So therefore, because there are different schools of thought within economics, it is important that they are exposed to at least two ways of thinking about it, at the very least. And the purpose of this is it helps students understand why there might be economists or different people who have very different standpoints from themselves. So, in a way, it is to better understand the differences that exist within the community of economists and therefore community of policymakers and general public, that I think that pluralism is a good approach to adopt.
Um, yeah, that was really helpful, Professor. So there is a lot of buzz around this book that it comes from a different school of thought. It comes from a heterodox approach, so but there is no explicit mention of this word heterodox economics in this book as such. Uh, and like I've been reading comments on social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, people are talking that okay, this book is an introductory macro book, which falls in heterodox category. So do you think that your book falls in the domain of heterodox economics? And how useful is this in teaching macroeconomics to students who are new to the subject?
So, yeah, I think I had to take a conscious decision of how I wanted to pitch it, and it's true that I don't make much reference to heterodox economics in the main text, but actually in the index I have put an entry for heterodox economics, and which asks the reader to look at classical economics or Keynesian economics. That was a way of saying that this is a non orthodox economics. And but to the question of is my textbook heterodox, I would say yes and no. Yes, it is heterodox because it introduces the student to a non-mainstream or a non-orthodox perspective, and no, because it also introduces the student in a critical sense to the mainstream approach. So in a way, it provides the mainstream approach, but in a critical fashion, and provides an alternative to it. Now, to your second question of how useful it is, again, I will go back to my previous response on pluralism. In order to understand the differences that exist within economists, among economists, I think that it is important to introduce students to at least one, certainly the dominant approach, because that's where most people are using those concepts to argue, but also an alternative approach, which I think is better suited. And what it does is it helps us to understand our own standpoint much more coherently. And it also helps us to understand where people are coming from. And we also understand the different vocabularies that uh, the mainstream economists are using. We also understand the different kind of vocabularies that maybe a non-mainstream economist is using, and how can we have some kind of a communication between them.
So, if you have to describe what exactly heterodox economics or pluralist economics is to a layman or a person picking up an introduction book for introductory book for macroeconomics, how would you distinguish heterodox econ and pluralistic economics from the mainstream economics? Just an idea for our audience, so they have an understanding.
Yeah.
What?
So, I was talking about this in a recent lecture that I did, so it's a bit fresh in my mind. And what I did was I took the definition of orthodoxy from Cambridge English Dictionary, which says that it is the dominantly accepted beliefs at a point in time. So, in a way, it is the dominant school of thought at a point in time. So, what is orthodox and what is heterodox depends on the location, depends also on the time. In that sense, it is historical in nature. So, given that currently what is mainstream in economics or what is orthodox in economics is the marginalist school of thought, that is considered to be orthodox economics. And there are different schools of thought which challenge it from outside the marginalist school of thought. And these schools of thought are called heterodox schools of thought. Now, you can do pluralistic economics, I think, in multiple ways. Maybe you can introduce a student to just the heterodox schools of thought, which are different in nature. Or you could introduce the student to the dominant school of thought and one heterodox school of thought. In other words, so then the student has an understanding of at least two schools of thought, and that is what I'm calling as a pluralistic kind of approach.
So, every school of thought has like some dominant economic thinkers. If we go to marginalist school of thought, so we have Jevons, Walras, and then if we talk about the Marxist school of thought, we have Marx and others. So if we have to pinpoint two, three thinkers from heterodox economics, because often, and this might not be a correct approach, but often students follow school of thoughts based on the famous thinkers. Can you name like few thinkers from heterodox economic thought?
Yeah, so there are many, but let me just restrict it to some people that maybe I have been influenced by, and one of them would be Adam Smith, um, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Krishna Bharadwaj, Piero Sraffa, Keynes, Kaletsky. So these are some of the people, but there are many, many other names that one can bring in into this group. And I think that the reason why I mention these names is also because there is a certain kind of affinity between all their thought process and their analytical framework. But you can have different people who have some similar heterodox views, such as Joan Robinson, Passanetti, Caldor, Minsky. But I've not engaged with their works in as much detail as I've engaged with these other works. So that's the reason I mentioned some of them.
So, so I'm moving to the next question, which deals with the Indian character that your book possesses. So, in what capacity does the book possesses that distinct Indian character?
Yeah. So when I first saw this question, I thought that it's very difficult as an author to answer this question. So I truly believe that it has to be assessed and judged by the readers. But let me just tell you briefly what I had in mind when I uh, used that phrase. So one was certainly the contextual. I mean, generally when macroeconomics is presented, it mainly comes from an American context or the British context. So how would a student sitting in Bangalore or somewhere in Bihar or somewhere in Nagaland be able to engage with uh, the macroeconomic ideas? And for that, I think there are two things which are necessary. One, there has to be some recognition of the Indian institution. So how the Reserve Bank functions, how the informal finance functions. So and some kind of a quantitative account of that. So that's one part of exploring the Indian nature. The other aspect is there are many qualitative aspects which are unique and specific to the Indian context, which I wanted to bring out. And the way I've tried to do it in this book is by using some excerpts from fiction, which is written by Indian authors. So both these put together, I thought that it gives a kind of a distinct kind of Indian character to it. Yeah.
So, just a small follow up. So, it gives a distinct Indian character in the sense because it uses Indian institutional framework, follows RBI instead of following Federal Reserve. Uh, do you think the book falls short in following up the Indian economic thought or the Eastern economic thought? Because what I see from the um, cover page itself, that they are mostly Western thinkers there. So is the economic thought is not Eastern or say Indic economic thought, rather the most Western economic thought?
Yeah. So this, I mean, this partly, I mean, I think I tried to engage with this by saying, I mean, very ahead in the preface itself, that most of the core kind of conceptual framework is certainly coming from Western thinkers, and there's no doubt about it. But through the work that I've cited of K.N. Raj, of Krishna Bharadwaj, of M.G. Rana Day, I tried to point out the limits of economic theory. And this economic theory could be orthodox, it could be heterodox. But there are some specific institutional and cultural and social characteristics of the Indian context which cannot completely be captured by any kind of theorizing, and where we need to really draw upon the insights that have been produced by people who have studied and recognize the Indian context. That's one. But maybe just to add on, when I say character, it is also, I think, a little bit to say that the style of writing itself is something that I feel. I mean, it is. I mean, it's out of an experience of being in India, of teaching students within India, and my own engagement with other students across various Indian colleges. So some of the questions that have come up, or the kind of questions, so there's a mix of all that, and that's the other reason for, I think, calling it uh, as some kind of an Indian character.
Okay. Um, so moving on to the next question. So in chapter 3, the text provides a very nice diagrammatic representation of the economic interconnection between the Reserve Bank of India, commercial banks, private firms, and households. And it sort of shows the transmission of RBI's policy rate to the interest rate in the economy. So, and so because you mentioned in the book that you have adopted an unsettling approach. So, have your experience as a professor at Azim Premji University influenced your the concept of communication? How should things be communicated, or does the use of illustrations come from this? The whole idea of using so many illustrations in the book itself. So, what are your comments and thoughts on that?
Okay, so let me try to answer it separately. One is the question of the unsettling approach, and I think this comes from my own study and work in the history of economic thought, where even when people are studying Adam Smith today, people might ask the question, what is there to study anymore? Because Adam Smith is written in 1776, and people have written so much about Adam Smith. But the important thing to remember is ideas are always being generated in different parts. We have certain experiences which come to us. There are political movements that happen, and we are always able to read the text in a new light. So these kinds of questions that we gather, I mean, it could come from students, it could come from reading another text, it could come from conversation. These are truly unsettling in a way. And when these kinds of questions come, we might have to revise what we think we already know. And I believe that in the process of education, and this is what I try and do in my classrooms as well, some questions are open ended, and some questions I do not give an answer to, because some of them I believe it is the responsibility of the student to read and to debate and to come up with answers. So it is in that sense that I partly mention the unsettling approach. Now, when about this illustration that I use for the monetary transmission mechanism, that particular one is actually inspired, and I've adopted it from the core textbook. But the use of so many illustrations actually is quite accidental in a way, because in 2015-16, I was asked to write an article for the magazine Teacher Plus, which is a magazine intended for high school, for teachers at the school level. And this was published in 2016 as Unlearning Economics. It was mainly a critical account of mainstream marginalist economics. And in that article, the editor wanted me to have some illustrations to accompany this article. So then I thought, I'd seen many students in class doodle and paint and draw and all that. So then I asked the class students, is there anyone who's interested in maybe doing some illustrations of, and based on what I had written. And that's how actually Sahana Subramaniam, who agreed, and who was also the illustrator for this book. And what I realized from the illustrations she had done for that article in 2016 was there was a wonderful and a strange kind of ability to communicate what I'm trying to say, but in a completely different medium, uh, using metaphors or illustrations how she wanted it. And then when the idea for the book came up, and when I started working on the book, I thought maybe it would be useful to have illustrations like that. So when I had asked her, and then she agreed, and I think that the illustrations give a very distinct character to the book, because they have their own logic, they have their own style. They are often portals to get into different kinds of dimensions of thinking, which my writing alone cannot provide. So in that sense, I'm very happy with the illustrations and how the entire thing has come about.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going through the illustrations, and they are really beautiful, and also they break the monotony of most of the econ books that have just graphs and tables and nothing else. So, moving on, the other question, that throughout the book you like seem to be shifting lenses. So, you have adopted the Keynesian approach to understanding the factors determining aggregate output, and then employment, and so. And while you use the classical and Sarafian approach to discuss inflation and quantity theory of money. So, could you comment on this unique aspect where you use different thinkers to explain different economic phenomena?
Uh, yeah, maybe I should have maybe clarified a little bit more, maybe somewhere in the text. But in the preface and in the acknowledgements, I write that this is, I mean, my own work in economics has been inspired by the work of classical political economists, along with that of Keynes, and then later of Sraffa, and how he revived classical economics. So it is, in a way, what I'm doing is I'm drawing on the research in this kind of a tradition, in the classical Sraffian Keynesian tradition, to throw light on different questions, macroeconomic questions, whether it's a question of output, whether it's a question of money, whether it's a question of economic growth. So even the chapter on economic growth is actually where we see a coming together of the Safian kind of in, interpretation or standpoint along with the Keynesian standpoint. And this is what I've applied through the entire text. And this is really the alternative to marginalist economics that I provide.
So, as you suggested that this, up to some extent, you said yes, this book comes from the heterodox viewpoint. So, and suggesting it to be used as a textbook, because you clearly use the word in macroeconomics textbook. So, uh, the introduction to macroeconomics, where most of the entrance exams or say masters in college in India promote the mainstream economic thought. So, and they used Marge's textbook. So, would this book will fit into the current economic education system of India, or say the nature of exams? I know there is some clarification, but or do you see it changing in future, that that Indian university might adopt an pluralistic economic approach in their entrance exams?
No, I think this, yeah, this is an important question to ask. And, after, I mean, when I use the word textbook in my book, I thought about it quite a bit. What do I mean by a textbook? And the way I'm now thinking about a textbook is basically a book that I've written to students. A book which I've basically written keeping undergraduate students as the primary audience. But it can be read by anyone. It can be read by somebody who is a postgraduate student, or it can be read by my colleagues, or a journalist. It can be read by anyone, but the primary audience has been an undergraduate student, and that's why I've called it a textbook. Uh, but then, when I think about the nature of books itself, I think that, especially in a university setting, in any kind of academic intellectual setting where we are engaging with ideas, it is important that we have books which question our received views and which help us in exploring some of these themes, widening our understanding, and also deepening our learning. So I think there is a role for it, but it's true that this kind of a learning, that what I have in mind, might not be ever captured by any examination systems. But the university spaces cannot be only understood based on the rankings or the marks that one gets or the grades that one gets in exams. So therefore, I would think that textbooks should not be written keeping only exams in mind, because textbook, after all, is a way in which we are communicating to students. And exams should not be set based on textbooks alone. So that can also be asking for some kind of wider learning. So I believe that, I don't know whether what will happen, but I do think that it's important for books to question, challenge, and unsettle the student.
So, follow up for small follow up for this question. So, in India, like I have been observing that there is a trend of many more economics programs are coming up. Many colleges are coming up with their own economics program, whether it's Ambedkar School of Economics, or whether many IITs starting their own economic programs. So there is this scene, can say in like colloquially, that India has an emerging scene in economics. So how do you see the and recognition of pluralism or heterodox economic approach among, because India is starting, uh, I mean, we can assume that India is starting a bit fresh when it comes to economics education, because in past there have been just few colleges that were dominant, but now there are many colleges coming up. So how do you think that there is recognition of heterodox or pluralistic economic approach in Indian universities or the new colleges that are emerging, and how would your book would benefit this kind of approach, those colleges, those who are open to take this kind of approach?
I mean, from my own kind of limited experience that I've had with giving talks at various colleges in India mainly, it is quite clear that, especially in Kerala now, many universities within Kerala, like Kannur University, MG University, Kerala University, they've all introduced or reintroduced some kinds of courses on political economy or history of economic thought or heterodox economics. And courses in political economy and history of economic thought have been present in, many colleges in India. So, and also, I think that in India, we've always had some culture of pluralism, although we might not have really called it that, because people are coming from a different context. And even if we have been learning mainstream economics, there has also been other schools of thought, especially the Marxist approach or the Marxist influence has been strong. So, in some sense, I think in India, we've always had some kind of pluralism. So that's one aspect of it. Now, as to the new institutions that are coming up and offering various economics programs, I think this book, in a way, will also be helpful and will communicate to the students there, because the book is, after all, set completely within the Indian context. And I believe that some of the questions that are posed in the book will help them, question some of the theories that they would be learning from other textbooks. In that way, there can even be a sort of a debate between two textbooks, or a debate between ideas, which can happen in the classroom, outside the classroom. And to me, a university space or a classroom space has to be lively, and it has to be about engagement. Of Also, it has to be about reflection. It cannot always be lively, but I think both have to come together. And I believe that this book is able to offer a little bit of contemplation, but also some amount of debate and engagement.
So often we see that what happens that these buzzwords that go around in every field, this happens. So whether it's in statistics, it's data science, or machine learning. So I that's my like personal feeling that that heterodox economic approach or pluralistic economic approach doesn't become a buzzword or just remains a topic of debate within the elite universities, like whether it's Ashoka University or Azim Premji University and Delhi School of Economics. So I was watching your interview in Purnia University recently. So, what are your efforts, or in your personal capacity, what are you doing to make sure that this book reaches to the masses? This book is accessible to the public universities in small towns, small cities, so they are exposed to this approach of heterodox or pluralistic economic approach, which is rightly set in Indian context.
Yeah. So, in a way, actually, it's funny you should ask this question, because part of the reason for writing this book is not, is really to address the needs of the students who might not have very well stocked libraries, who might not get a lot of exposure. So that's why I've not tried to, summarize what Rana Day has said or what Safa has said, because I want them to have that flavor. And also so that they can be exposed to different ways of thinking, different ways of writing. And what I mean, in my limited capacity, what I've been trying to do is, if somebody asks me for a talk, it's always a great moment for me, and it's a pleasure for me to have this conversation, because I get fresh questions from the students in these universities. And this is also helpful, like a conversation. And I think that we need to have more conversations within on between colleges, state colleges, smaller colleges, because often, like you said, that it's often the conversation happens within the elite spaces, whether it's in India or abroad, because they have more money, they have more exposure, they have more privilege of various kinds of time and resources. But I think it's important that we try to engage and communicate with as many people as we can, given my target audience. So I've been trying to do that, and I hope. I mean, I'm looking forward to more such talks, especially in smaller state universities and colleges.
Yeah. Um, so I, in chapter 6, you under the section good theories and demand for data. So you write about the importance of theories underlying the data collection process. So could you comment on the underlying theory in the Indian context?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm going to take the question slightly differently, and what I mean by this is, even let's take the context of understanding economic growth. Now, historians have debated as to whether colonialism has contributed to growth or not, or before that, was there economic growth or not. But the question to ask is, where is the historian getting their framework of understanding economic growth? And most often, and whatever I've come across at least, most of them seem to be adopting the supply side theory of growth, where technology often is seen uncritically. So if you are a Marxist historian, there is a different angle that can be brought in. But in general, if you adopt a supply side growth theory, then from the historical data, you're trying to extract information like what are the labor inputs, what are the growth of capital inputs, what is the growth of technology, and how to represent that. But suppose you are introduced to the demand led growth theory approach and you think that's how growth happens. Then, from the historical data, you will try to extract the growth of autonomous consumption. How do you understand the growth of autonomous investment? What is the growth of government expenditure? What is the role of exports? So the way in which the data might be the same, but what kind of information or subsequent data that you extract from it can really vary. So that's one larger point. The other thing is something like having a better understanding of sectoral growth models, or what I call meso approach in my book, which draws on the work of Francois Quesnay, Karl Marx, Piero Sraffa, and more empirically, Vasily Leontief, where we need to have more data which captures structural interdependence. And in other words, we need to have more frequent input output data in the Indian economy, and not just focus on GDP data, which is also important, but we need to have efforts for this. And a similar kind of approach or similar kind of push has been there for having more kind of data on time use surveys. This is coming from feminist political economists, so that we have a better understanding of how time is divided. Similarly, from ecologically oriented economists and who think of ecology as central to uh, economic understanding in a society, there has been arguments for having a green GDP. So better kinds of how do we incorporate fundamentally environmental questions into our output and income measures. So these are all coming from certain, it could be coming from a political standpoint, but there is some sort of an interconnection between the political standpoint and the conceptual framework. So I think this is what I mean when I say that we need to have theories which are able, which alert us to the fact that such data is not yet available and we should collect them. That is one. The other is there might be historical data available, but what kind of quantitative data can we meaningfully extract from that?
So I have a small follow up on that. So often what we are collecting and what definitions we make come from the system of national accounts, and that is the broad accounting framework which is widely accepted and followed. And that those huge books have a lot of underlying economic theory going in, and based on that data is collected. So are you suggesting an alternate approach for system of national accounts? a pluralistic approach in the accounting framework itself that can incorporate, say, women's work or say answering ecological questions in a different way? Are you suggesting something of that sort?
Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, I haven't really thought about it. I mean, in the specific context or system of national accounts, but yes, I would say, because it depends on who are the people who are involved in creating these national accounts, whatever kind of accounting system. In fact, I would argue that any kind of accounting is deeply political, because if we decide what to measure, we are also making a decision on what not to measure. If we decide what to account for, we are also equally making a decision of what not to account for. And this is a deeply political question. And it means that we need to be exposed to multiple standpoints, and people who are all kinds of people and identities and concerns should be represented. But if this is made in a largely homogeneous group of people, then there can be homogeneous not just in terms of identity, but also in terms of the framework of thought. The accounting will reflect those identities and the framework of thought.
So, what is the right time to introduce, or is it at, important at all to introduce teaching accounting frameworks to student of economics? And would it fall under a heterodox approach or not?
Yes, so I think that accounting is absolutely important, but it needs to be introduced in a way in which it communicates with theories. So why did certain kind of accounting frameworks come up? It needs to be introduced where the students can also bring their personal experience to bear. Accounting cannot be seen as something that is outside the domain of debate, of political debate, of understanding. So I think that we need to maybe engage with what can be called the philosophy of accounting itself, but also understand the history of accounting. But which means that what are the kinds of people who have been involved, which are the countries who have been involved, what are the kind of dominant frameworks that they have used, and what has gotten left out in the process. And now today's, what are the things we think are important, and how can we account for them?
So the second part of my question, that does it fall under the heterodox approach?
So I would not say that it falls under. It can fall under any kind of an undergraduate training. It is not necessarily orthodox or not necessarily heterodox, um, because if there is a theoretical framework, there are implications for accounting. There are implications for policy. So in that sense, whichever framework that you are in, you will also have an associated set of accounting frameworks. So yes, I mean in that sense, yes, but it is applicable to any kind of theory, whether orthodox or heterodox.
So in your book, you do talk about national accounting. You give a brief description about flow of funds also, and talk about Copeland. So one question I was thinking about from that um, you also have this section where you cover intersectoral flows. So since this topic is interest to me and I'm curious, I want to know, I'm working on my thesis. So about your take on RBI clubbing households and net profit into a single sector, given that the latter might behave like a corporation in some cases.
Sorry, so what was the question? What is my take on that? Or
Yeah. So like RBI clubs both households and non-profit into a single sector, but given that later might behave in a corporation in some cases, non-profits. I mean,
I
we
mean,
don't
yeah,
have exact clarity on how not-profit organizations behave.
yeah.
So,
So I don't know. I haven't really thought about it much. Maybe it was just just one sentence or two sentences in the book. But again, my sense is that if, as a researcher, you are working in this area, and if you feel some kind of a discomfort in this kind of a classification, then I feel you should pursue it. Because, well, it might be the case that some accounting frameworks are done because of existing data available, and sometimes people might not have thought how to obtain this other kind of information, and therefore subsequent frameworks just go with that. So all I can say is that if you think that something might be amiss here, or something seems, I mean, you don't find it completely satisfactory, it's something worth exploring. But I myself don't have a view on it.
Okay. So as like one very common exercise we did in history of economic thought class was comparing the table of contents. So I have done the same for your book also. So I've compared with a very common book, MenQ Intro to Macro. And one stark difference, which I mean, it's completely different, but one thing which completely stood out was there is a chapter dedicated to welfare taxation in MenQ, which has not found a comprehensive mention in your book. So, is there a particular reason why that is the approach you are taking in this book?
Yes. So I don't think I have, a carefully thought out answer to it. Uh, but yeah, taxation is only mentioned, I think, not substantially really. But
You
part
deal
of the
with
reason,
carbon taxation and all such things in the book.
yeah, it's very, very introductory in that sense. And maybe I talk a little bit about direct and indirect taxes, and a little
Hmm.
bit in connection to the question of public expenditure. But the reason for that is, I believe that taxation, like many, many things, is also deeply political. And I am not so sure how much, uh, a model, whether it's completely heterodox or orthodox, can really provide guidance on that. Because in the question of taxation, there are just so many competing needs, competing demands, competing philosophies, also as to whether one should be taxed, one should not be taxed. And in that sense, it's also a deeply political matter. And but maybe you're right. Maybe I should have engaged in retrospect. Now that I think about it, maybe it is something that should have gotten maybe more attention and maybe some more paragraphs. But yeah, maybe I should think about it.
Yeah. So like few last set of questions, which I think I they just came when I was thinking more about all these things. Um, so when you adopt a pluralistic view, and so as a writer, when you're thinking about writing a book introduction to macroeconomics for undergraduate students, and you have to take a pluralistic approach, bringing in many theories together. A 200 pages book, was it a constraint in writing? And uh, where did you make trade-off, or did you think that bringing in many things together might dilute engagement at introduction level, where maybe this particular topic needs more attention of students? So
Yeah. So the way I thought of the book was, one, I didn't want it to be too big, because we know that the size can is sort of sometimes when students see the size of books, you don't want to read it or pick it up at all. So I wanted the book to be of a size like this, where the student will feel comfortable to go through it fully, and maybe even more than once. Then the question was, what is it that I can do that the other textbooks haven't done? So there are many discussions which I have not really engaged with, but have been done much better, much more well in Mancu's textbook or many other textbooks. So I have not really tried to repeat the same thing over and over again. Then what I've so the critical part in the marginalist framework is what is often not found. So I've given some introduction of it and tried to engage with it, and then application of the classical political economy kind of framework on the Indian economy. And so I didn't think this was a constraint, and I think I have written what I really wanted to say in these many words. And but maybe the question of taxation, there might be some aspects which I think I could have expanded a little bit. But I think that as an introduction, I think that to me, I didn't think I made any kind of significant trade-offs.
So one last question, which I think I've always asked myself, because in this university has made me a critical thinker. So do you think your book is taking a normative approach? And often there is, I've heard people saying that if you take a normative approach, the objectivity goes. So did you feel that way for your book?
Uh, okay, so I'm not going to respond to that question directly, but I will respond to it in a different way. Because this is a question that I've been thinking about a little bit more in depth. This relation between positive economics and normative economics. And generally in microeconomics textbooks, there is this, I mean, you start off by saying that we are not concerned with what ought to be, we are concerned with what is. Right? So you get into a discussion of positive economics. But the basic fact of any kind of social study, which of which economics is one, is the fact that what we think what what is today is a consequence of what ought to be yesterday. Yesterday people thought that this is how the world should be, that's why we have, the contemporary world. So the question of what is and what ought to be cannot be neatly separated, or the questions of in social sciences how I think a human being should behave will have an impact on what kind of policies I recommend so that the human being should behave this way. So within social sciences, I believe it is not possible to remove this kind of a normative aspect. And it is for this reason, and in a way rightly so, that economics, in when classical political economists were writing, it was called political economy. There was an explicit recognition of the fact that there are normative considerations which have to enter. And now, and in fact, I mean, I'm going to give actually a set of lectures later this week on the politics of microeconomics, where I point out, where I trace out the so-called positive economics that is there in microeconomics, marginalist microeconomics, actually has a lot of hidden normative standpoints.
So can we anticipate an intro to micro book also from you?
Okay, I shall not comment on that.
Okay, so thank you, Professor, for talking to me on your book. It was a pleasure talking to you, and got a great perspective on your book. And congratulations for your publication. And I wish that it becomes a bestseller of the year.
Thank you so much, Shubhankar, for having me. And certainly, I mean, asking these questions to push me a bit beyond what, some of the things that I've already written.
Thank you, Alex.